Qiuyuan has been out for a while now, so let's evaluate whether my pre-release pros and cons were accurate or not. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. Okay, so, starting off, he is an excellent echo skill damage buffer. This was pretty obvious, it was very evident that that was going to be his main gimmick. And yes, that did indeed end up holding true in my opinion. He is a good echo skill damage buffer, and if you're interested in that, well then he is going to be the best possible investment for that. Now I should point out, that is a fairly niche archetype, and while I do think that they very much could add characters in the future that are able to utilize that specific mechanic, as of now, we only have 2 units that are able to do so, those being For Phrolova and Galbrena. Now thankfully, those 2 characters are extremely strong right now, but I think something to note now is that in this particular post-release, yes, Qiuyuan is indeed a great echo skill damage buffer, thus making him quite valuable because he's really good for those 2 particular DPSs. However, keep in mind, his value is tied to those characters. He's always going to be a good echo skill damage buffer, but for now, we cannot promise or know or see into the future as to whether we're going to get more characters that are going to be able to utilize this buff. As of now, that is a very good thing, because For Phrolova and Galbrena are very strong. However, when those 2 start to fall off in performance, then all that echo skill damage buffing isn't going to matter so much anymore. But what I will say is that, for now, yes, this has ended up proving to be very useful, and yes, this quality of his is indeed very prevalent. However, because at S0 he doesn't really put that much stock into his damage, he does have some personal damage, it's just not really his main thing. This is where the majority of his value lies at S0. I should also add that if you are somebody that has S3 to 6 Qiuyuan, you're also able to play him as a main DPS. This is how I personally play him, as I'm opting to main him from here on out. So, in terms of his DPS performance, at S3, he generally ends up feeling like a regular meta strong DPS. I would say that that's the minimum requirement if you want to play him as a main DPS. Before then, it's not that he has absolutely no damage, it's just that it's not really high enough to justify playing him as a DPS. However, you'll find that his performance is more than satisfactory at that point. If anything, you might be a little bit impressed. I was personally impressed. I actually think that S3 is pretty solid. Now, about his S6, it is very good for him, and it's going to be a really big performance increase from S3. Just keep in mind that relative to S6s on DPS characters, because Qiuyuan is ultimately intended as a support, his S6 DPS performance is definitely going to be a lot less than another character that was intended to be played as a DPS at S6. However, if that's not your concern and you just want to play him as a main DPS, yes, that is absolutely more than possible. But you're gonna have to invest a little bit in order to do so. Generally, you're gonna want to play him with either Mortefi on Static Mist or Yuno. Both of them are gonna be able to buff up his heavy attacks. I should actually add, I quite enjoy the Yuno synergy. I've been having fun with that one. Both of them are very fun, of course, though. As for his first 2 sequences, they are good, they're just not sufficient enough to make him a good main DPS. His S1 does help out with his damage because it gives him 20% crit rate, but his S2 is more supportive, and a big damage increase lies for him within the S3. That is whenever he starts to be a viable main DPS in my opinion. I do want to touch on main DPS Qiuyuan more in some future videos. For now, I'm gonna leave it at this. He is a good main DPS at S3, like he feels very strong to be honest. Better than what I was expecting considering how much he's been tailored to be a support. And at S6, he is very, very good, like really good, don't get it twisted. However, you would get more out of investing that same amount into a character that is intended as a main DPS. But either way, he does have really good sequences, and I do find that his DPSing is strong. This is just from my initial testing and whatnot. I'll be able to comment more on this the more that I play him, of course, because I intend to play him a lot, let me tell you that. So, about him being great for Phrolova, I mentioned that before, and I really hyped up how this guy was going to be able to push Phrolova to the next level, and I do indeed think that he ended up being a good pull for Phrolova. In fact, a good pull is underselling it a little bit because he is the current best 3rd slot teammate for that character, and if you're ever worried about Phrolova falling off in TOA in the future, just direct your gaze to Whimpering Wastes, my friend. I think Phrolova has a pretty long shelf life ahead of her. So, why is this? Well, because he has multiple Echo skill casts within his kit that he uses quite often, he's able to help out in activating Hecate's enhanced attacks. He also enjoys the 25% heavy percent that Phrolova is able to provide on outro whenever you swap into him once you finish your rotation on her. So all around it ends up being an excellent synergy, and he ends up being a really good pull for her, so if you're a Phrolova main, yeah, he ends up being worth it for her by quite a good margin. I also mentioned that he was going to be the best in slot for Galbrena. Now this is an interesting case, because I actually feel like he's more of a Phrolova pull than a Galbrena pull, and this is for one simple reason. If you already have a highly invested Brent and Lupa, then you don't really need to get Qiuyuan, especially if you have that invested Lupa. Brent you can drop in favor of Mortefi if you don't have Brent Wuthering Waves. However, you can't really drop Lupa if you're looking to possibly not get Qiuyuan, because I will say that if you have Lupa, then honestly, while Qiuyuan is better and is still the best in slot, you can very much get away with not pulling him if you're fine enough to just use your Lupa. However, his kit is indeed very much tailored towards Galbrena, so if you're wondering, is he a good pull for Galbrena? Yes, he is. I think it just depends on, do you care about the small increase that you would get if you already have a really invested fusion setup? Now, if you don't have your fusion setup that invested, Qiuyuan exponentially becomes a better pull, because the less investment you already have, the more his low cost requirement ends up becoming appealing. What I mean by this is that it's a lot cheaper to just get one Qiuyuan as opposed to investing into an entire fusion setup if you haven't already started that yet. So, best in slot for Galbrena? Yes. Absolutely needed for Galbrena? No, there is definitely ways to circumvent it, but he is still very much the best in slot if you're looking for Galbrena's absolute top performance. I mentioned in my pros and cons how he was going to be on the lower side when it comes to damage, and I would say that at S0 to 2, yes, that is the case, but whenever you go higher up in sequences, like I've already discussed, he does have DPS potential. It's unfortunately not really a case like Yuno and Brandt where at S0 you can play him as a main DPS. I mean, I suppose you could really try to force it, it's just not going to be very good. Whereas if you were to do that at higher sequences, it would actually end up being a pretty competitive Arrow DPS team. Honestly, I do think that his DPS performance is pretty good at the higher sequences. However, at S0 to 2, I just don't really recommend playing him like that because of his lower damage. It does hurt his flexibility a little bit, I suppose, but he was always designed to be a more niche unit in the first place. Because, for example, you're easily able to add Yuno and Brandt in many different situations because of their high personal damage. However, with Qiuyuan, his personal damage is there, it's just not really as prevalent as somebody like Brandt Mothering Waves or Yuno in their respective teams at S0, for example. However, either way, he does have damage, it's just don't expect to get a lot of it. And like I already discussed, DPS Qiuyuan is very much a thing, you just have to get a couple of sequences first. So, how about his shelf life? Okay, well like I already said earlier, his value is basically tied to Phrolova and Galbrena. However, this is not new. Think about Juja. That character was really good for a considerable amount of time. She was amazing for Jinchi, and then she ended up being amazing for Carlotta, and whenever Carlotta first came out, Jinchi was still a top tier character. So there was a time where Juja ended up being this really good second slot teammate pull, and I still think that character is still a pretty good pull if you're a Carlotta main, because she still ends up being our best in slot for hypercarry situations. So, as you can see, that is an example of a more niche support that has had their value tied to particular characters that still lives to this day just because I would say Wuthering Waves is generally a well-balanced game, and Carlotta is still just a very strong DPS, because even if Jinchi has indeed fallen off, Carlotta is still a strong character. And it's basically just gonna be the same with Qiuyuan. For as long as Phrolova and Galbrena are good characters, he is also going to be a good character. I personally think that Phrolova in particular is gonna make sure that he has quite the nice amount of shelf life. I wouldn't really worry about this for a while because it takes a really long time for a DPS to genuinely fade into obscurity, and even then, we generally get new additions so often to the point where those older DPSs that aren't that good do manage to still stay relevant and playable. Qiuyuan is a really good example of this. He is a 1.0 DPS and he is still getting new teams to this day. Right now, I believe his best in slot is Yuno Shikona. Obviously, Qiuyuan's in a different position because he's more in line with Juja's category of character, but either way, the point that I'm trying to get across is that I'm not particularly worried about his shelf life for now. I think that he's at least going to be relevant for the next couple of months or so, which I think is more than enough time to enjoy a character that you pull for. And another thing that I mentioned is that he would end up being kind of replaceable. Yes, I see what I was getting at, but he's just so good for Phrolova that I don't really think it's that big of a deal. Like, sure, you can use Roshia instead. Whoa, you can use Roshia instead. Such a valuable pull, you know what I mean? Like, unless you already have a Roshia, then that's just kind of a point that doesn't really matter. Because, yeah, sure, there are other options, but the other options kind of suck. And it's just better to get a Qiuyuan for your account as opposed to a Roshia. He has more pull value on the whole. And sure, you could use Shorekeeper, but she's very highly demanded among many other teams. Galbrena is more of a one that comes into question here because, like I said earlier, you very much can get away with not owning him and still having very high Galbrena performance, provided that you haven't invested Lupa. Well, I will say yes, that's true, very much so. However, he's still best in slot. So this point of him being replaceable, while it's true in the sense of you don't really need him and you can get by without him for sure, an account does not require him whatsoever, and Phrolova and Galbrena are going to continue to feel like very strong DPSs without him, he's still best in slot for two strong characters. So either way, keep that in mind. Sure, he's replaceable, but he's still the best option. And now for the moment you've all been waiting for. Where do I currently think Qiuyuan stands in the meta? I think he's really strong, to be honest. Like, this is a good character, dude. Obviously, I might not be saying this 5 reruns down the line when we've gotten a new good Havoc DPS that can replace For Phrolova, and when we get another Fusion DPS that replaces Galbrena. Maybe he's just not going to become relevant over time. Who knows? But either way, as of now, and at least for the next couple of banners, I do believe that he is a good pull. I think his hair is very fluffy. This isn't relevant, I just think it looks really fluffy and I like that. And he's a good character. I like him very much, I can't wait to play him some more. I also need to do a story, I'm actually really excited to do that. Hopefully this video was able to tell you what I think about Qiuyuan now that he's been out for a while. This has been Juice, signing out, and I hope you all enjoy aura farming with him.